This conference will
Welcome
now be recorded.
to January 24th Technical Advisory Committee. I'm Kelly Hammer-Levy from Pinellas County, co-chair. And so welcome this morning. We'll go around the room and do introductions.
Christian Cynthia Swiftmud.
Dan Paul, Tampa Audubon Society. Vicki Parsons, Bay Soundings.
Morning, Mark Tramick, NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service.
Nicole Maloney, Pinellas County.
Megan. Action Commission of Hillsborough County.
Tampa Bay Estuary Program.
Carrie Flaherty Walia, Tampa Bay Estuary Program. Andy Murray, WRA Engineering.
Okay, Stacy Day, Pinellas County. We have the area.
Hi, I'm Adontis, Pinellas County.
Kara Radabal, FWC.
Sheila Scalaro, Tampa Bay Estuary Program.
Sarah Napier, Pinellas County.
Steve Myers, USF Marine Science.
Mark Luther, USF Marine Science.
Bill Faring, Friends of Wheaton Island.
And we
Tampa Bay Estuary Program is now running the TAC on the TBEP side, so grievances, complaints.
Thought about you, Graham.
There's a list. So thank you everyone online. We appreciate you being here today. So we're going to go ahead and get the agenda kicked off with wave monitoring at Philippi Park in support of living shorelines with Steve Myers.
To it, huh?
I don't know, but
It's working. This is way working. I know, right. Now, good morning. Today I want to talk about a project that many of you are familiar with. The installation of living shorelines in Felipe Park. And our contribution to this project was the monitoring and the quantification of the wave environment in the bay just adjacent to the park. A lot of people have contributed to our component of this in various ways. Lyndon Cheek, Laura Acevedo, Mauricio Zarias, Megan Kramer, Mark Luther at USF, at Sherwood, Marcus Beck at TBEP, CCD, Rob Burns, Alexandra Wheelan, and Zach Westfall at Nelson County. Hopefully I got everybody. We're familiar with the location. I'm not going to talk too much about it. I'll talk about the motivation, the objectives of our study, the equipment that we use monitoring. Present the highlights of our analysis. I'm not going to go into excruciating detail, but I hope that everybody will come away not just with an idea of the results of this study, but a pretty good intuitive sense of the kind of capabilities that we have in terms of wave monitoring. Since waves are a problem not just in Felipe Park, but around the bay and increasingly. So Felipe Park, located in the northern portion of on the right are two images. Park on this here. Our site offshore. So this upper one is taken at And you'll see that the second picture, again, here's the seawall. The part higher tidal stage. So you see that the shoreline is covered. That becomes important for the seawall. Before, a boat had passed from this direction here and produced a wake. And you can see the lines of the wake here. So boat wakes are packets of waves. They're not just a single burst. They're a whole series of wave crests that and you can see them here impacting the seawall at an angle.
Steve, can you
Yes.
use the mic up front, please?
Oh, sorry. All right. Is this better? Okay. And we do it here. You can see the mouse. All right. So now if you squint, you can also see these lines, these crest lines here, right, going at a different angle. So these reflected waves. This is the wake reflecting off at seawall. So there's additional wave energy. The wave doesn't just hit the wave hits the wall and it gets reflected back out into the water. Because waves cause they sediment, they short. And so the solution, of course, is installation of living shorelines. And until very recently, there's not been a lot of studies of how effective they are, any quantitative studies. So we want to know what's the waves like in the bay before and after installation of living shorelines. So this is the before study. Our installation location here, this is a non-Pachardo for Tampa Bay. The installation is marked with the red dot. So Mark designed this custom configuration of high frequency connectors. They actually had never been put together in this way before, even though it's a simple geometry and wave arrays have been around for a long time. With these sensors, this was something new, and it caused a little bit of problems with some of the engineering, and we had to work through some of the issues with the manufacturer, but we got through that, and then we were able to take some measurements. So, for example, at the bottom here, this is a time series of the water depth obtained from.
Is that like a pencil next to it? Is that for scale?
No, that is
How big are
the
these?
sensor itself.
Oh, so the one on the left is the
So-
sensor as well?
So the little red one is the sensor, and the white one is the data logger.
How big are these things?
Mark?
The pressure sensors themselves are about 6 to 8 inches long, 3/4 inch to 1 inch in diameter. And then the data loggers, standard size data logger, probably 16, 18 inches long and 2 or 3 inches in diameter. And it's just PVC pipe
Yeah.
glued together in a square 2 meter by 2 meter grid frame.
The biggest part is how the battery.
That was the big issue, is the manufacturer says, oh yeah, the internal batteries will last for 30 to 40 days. It lasted 3. And so they gave us this external battery pack that was the size and weight of a scuba tank, had 48 D cells in it. So that had to lay along, that's not in the diagram, that lays alongside of it right here.
So it took some negotiation. First, we had to determine what the problem was. So the deployment, here's an aerial view. You can see the seawall. Whoops. See the seawall here. And the deployment location is out here about 60 meters offshore. And these green lines, they indicate the rough range, approximate range over which we determined that waves could be coming off of the sea. That's our range. This is just a picture of a boat wake. This is not Old Tampa Bay, obviously, but there are certain universal properties of wakes. Like I said, they're a packet. They're comprised of multiple crests. And if you put a sensor out here, you get a whole series of crests and bursts, and I'll show you that in a moment. They also have certain geometric properties. Most commonly, they propagate away from the ship line at an angle of about 35 degrees. That varies depending upon water depth and ship size and speed. So we tried various deployments. Like I said, it took a while to work things out, but by summer of 2022, we had the system working. We had one deployment with a single sensor and then 2 deployments with a full array. The last one lasted for 29 days. That's what I'm going to be focusing on. To help validate what we're seeing in the sensors, Stacy and Alex drove a boat back and forth in the vicinity of the sensor at various distances and various speeds. And then we stood on the shoreline, and so we're able to actually record the impact and timing of the sensor. So we know exactly what is a boat wake and what's not. So that helped us in distinguishing the whole set of boat wakes throughout the. So here's time series from the 4 sensors. This is pressure compared to water depth. You can see the spring neap cycle and you can see the diurnal and semi-diurnal tides. Like through most of Tampa Bay, the tidal range is plus or minus half a meter. And this actually becomes another, and this is useful also because you can define the relative depth. So that is where you are between the maximum water depth and the minimum water depth. Right, that's going to become relevant for understanding our results. Right, but we're not really interested in tides. We're interested in these high frequency waves. So we do a high pass filter. And so this is the high pass filter of each of the sensors. And you see what's a lot of these bursts, right? These very episodic bursts throughout at all the sensors, right? So what are we looking at? Well, we zoom in, and we found 2 distinct types of wave bursts. First one is associated with the winds. This is, they're characterized by a fairly steady frequency and variable amplitude. And then the other one is a classic boat wake, which is a variable frequency and not quite as irregular an amplitude. As you can see, it's a little bit slower here and it gets faster and faster. In time series analysis, that's called a chirp. And like I said, it's a classic boat wake signature due to the dispersion of the wave packets. We can go into that if you want at some point. We can run some basic statistics looking at average wave amplitudes, maximum wave amplitudes, significant wave amplitudes. Last one is an important term for civil engineering, design of coastal infrastructure. Basically, it's the average of the highest third of waves. So we found maximum amplitudes are on the order of several centimeters, right? Plus or minus up to 10 centimeters. Those are the biggest waves we've seen. And more typically, they're plus or minus half a meter, but that's just, average over all time. So that's interesting, but we really want to know what's going on in terms of the propagation of these waves. So this is a plot, what's called the directional wave spectrum, or DIWAS. And I'll show you how to look at it. So in the middle here, this red dot is our gauge. Right? And the distance here, this is, like I said, this is a spectrum. So you go, the radius here is frequency. So we're going from frequency of 0.1 hertz to 1, which is like a period of 10 seconds here down to 1 second. And you see the range of peaking around 7 seconds. That's the by color here. Right, so yellow is the highest intensity, so we're getting a lot of intensity around 2 seconds or so. And this is the angle here, the position around the circle. That's the direction that the waves are coming from. So here, this peak here, this indicates a lot of wave energy coming from the north. Now over here, we have a lot of wave energy coming in from the west-southwest. Now, because this is a power spectrum, we can chop it up and integrate it and do, sum over different angles or different frequency ranges and partition it how we like and look at the relative energy coming in. So for example, from different directions. So we can look at our reflecting range. How much do we think is coming off the seawall? And then we can look at, and the rest of it would be considered the incoming wave energy. So we can do that. That's interesting. We do that for every hour of that 30-day deployment. And we get, whoops, wrong button. This upper plot here. So the blue is the incoming energy, the orange is the reflected energy. If this is on a logarithmic scale, so these small differences you see are actually very big differences. So the reflected energy is usually is always less than the incoming energy. And if you look at the ratio of that time, that's the second plot here. And you can see with your eye that there's this ceiling. I mean, except for a few spikes here and there, there's the ceiling in the ratio between the reflected and the incoming. So there's something going on that's kind of limiting the amount of reflected energy. So what is that? Well, we want to look at the relative depth. Remember, we saw that at low tide, the shoreline is exposed. High tide, it's not. So if you have a high water level, the waves are going to be able to reach the wall and reflect much better than if they have to ride over some sand bottom. But then we looked at this ratio as a function of the relative water depth, and we can see, so the horizontal here is the relative water depth, the ratio here. We're saying this cluster around just over 0.4 for the higher water depth, right? And very little good reflectivity is ever measured. So that makes sense. Now we used another mathematical tool that's been widely applied in recent years to the analysis of ship wakes. It's called wavelet analysis. And so I'll show you how this works. So here's a time series over about 2.5, 3 hours from one of the sensors. And this is the high frequency passing. You can see our bursts. This is how the wavelet decomposition works. So this horizontal axis is time, which is the same time here. The vertical axis is the frequency. Again, we're going from 0.1 hertz to 1, 10 seconds. This is slower. This is faster. And we take two different types of structures in this decomposition that corresponds to those different kinds of waves. First, we see these arcs here, these streaks, not quite vertical. They bend a little bit to the right repeatedly throughout time series. And then we see this kind of keyboard-like structure. Right? So remember, since the vertical axis is frequency, this is where something is going from low frequency to high frequency. And then this is pretty steady frequency. It's just irregular in its amplitude. So so these streaks, these arcs are the boat waves, and this is the wind-driven waves. So since we can identify these, come up with some objective technique for finding those waves based on these characteristics. And then we can look at the statistics. How many are there? How often do they occur? What are their amplitudes? How much energy do they have? And how does that compare to what the winds are doing? Okay, so this is another example at the top. This is during those boat passes that I mentioned that Stacy and Alex did. Down here, this is the wavelet decomposition of this time boat waves. And it's all just boat waves. There's very little wind at the time. We got lucky on that day. So we have very clean signals. So we're able to test our objective technique for finding these. And it worked pretty well. Once we did that, we can run some more analyses. For example, what time of day do these occur, right? So when we look at that, we find most of them occur between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. daylight hours, okay? Makes sense. We can also look at what we think are reflected waves, which these double, see some of these have a double structure to them. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but we identified those as waves that have a strong reflective component. And if you look at when those occur, we look at that, all the reflections for the 30 days that we looked at, there was out of 95 wave opals we found, 32 were had a reflection. They all occurred at higher water levels. Again, that makes sense. Okay, so how do I know, why do we think that we're looking at reflected waves when we have this double structure, right? So again, here's a burst. This is from one of our single sensors. This is a wave packet. You can kind of see the boat structure a little bit slower in the beginning, getting faster. This is the wavelet decomposition. Again, the horizontal axis is time, the vertical axis is frequency, low frequency to high frequency. And you see this double structure. So this first one looks like a classic boat wave, low frequency. Then we use our DIWASP analysis, our directional wave spectrum. And again, so the gauge is in the center. The angle around the center is the direction that the waves are coming from. And the radius is the frequency. Frequency range is here, low frequency in the center, high frequency outside. And we're seeing, if you look at just the first minute here, right, which is comprised primarily of this burst, seeing a signal from the north and west. It's where the boat's passing. And if we look at it, the entire signal, the entire wave burst, we have a second source now coming from the south. It's from the seawall. So there's no boat between the sensor and the seawall, so it had to be a reflected wave. So to summarize, the waves in Whidbey Park, most places, are composed of both wind-driven winds and boat-driven wakes. The wave energy at this location was from the north, that's propagating towards the seawall. And a significant amount of wave energy does get reflected from the seawall, or impacts the seawall and then gets reflected. I didn't talk about this, but interesting thing was that the wakes we found were only present about 4% of the time. So 96% of the time there's no boat wave there. But they comprise 10% of the total wave energy. That means this. So that's because they're much higher amplitude generally than the wind-driven waves. As we said a few times, the boat wakes reflect from the seawall when the water levels are high. And all these methods, all this technology that we have now is applicable to other locations. And we're starting to look at that, some other locations. We do the same kind of study. That's it. Thank you.
Can you go back to the slide that had the wavelet equation on it? I was just, I was trying to write something down. The H prime, I believe. Yeah, that one right there. So that H prime.
As a high pass.
Okay. So the graph on the bottom, does that movement from low frequency to high frequency, does that give you any indication of the intensity of the wave, or is it just looking at frequency? Like,
Well,
that's
all right.
low.
Okay, so what this is the wavelet amplitude. So what we do is wavelets work by, it's a convolution of the high frequency, the high pass signal with in this case, a complex wavelet, right? So when you're transforming not just into time frequency, but also from real space into complex space. And then you can get an amplitude in the phase. So this is the amplitude spectrum. And so from that, this is directly related to the amplitude of the signal up here. As you can say if it's just a scale, right? Raise your amplitude, you pull it out, and then it scales the spectrum. So that's why this is why this stands out from the background.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to ask, we did some work in Crystal River, Citrus County, Kings Bay area, and we were looking at occurrence of oyster habitat along boat channels. And what we were finding is that consistently, if you were within I think it was about 100, I can't remember if it was 100 feet or 100 meters of the boat channel, you did not see oysters, although the habitat, the substrate would suggest that oysters would be there. And so we kind of concluded, in a qualitative way, that the proximity of that substrate to the boat channel that prevented the oysters from colonizing, we thought that energy. So would this be a method to try to kind of tease that out a little bit more in a quantitative way, if you had the ability to measure, deploy one of these sensors out there and measure that energy coming in from the channel?
Yeah, in fact, we're just talking about that. With this method, you can identify the boat wakes, and then you can look at the wave amplitude. On wave amplitude, you can get an idea of how much resuspension there might be, how much disturbance at the bottom. So and you can get the frequency, the amplitude, the water depth. You can make that calculation.
Might be a great method for like a site suitability analysis. If you have an area that you want to enhance for oyster habitat or living shoreline, I think it's a great tool.
And as Steve pointed out, the wave energy is 10% of the total energy, because wind waves also stir things up, but they're much lower amplitude, even though they're much more consistently. One big do much more damage to critical marine habitat than, all the storms that come through in a year. Just because, the energy of stirring up scout bottom goes like the cube wave. So, and that's what goal of this was to look at, once they put a lift, affected wave changes appreciably, which you'd think it would, just because of the sort of accidental result that at low tide, we don't get the reflection like you do at high tide because you got all that bottom slope to dissipate the wave energy, then just bouncing straight off of the wall. But again, so that the waves are creating enough scour that the oyster larvae just can't settle and grab hold of something.
And is that, I mean, if you have strong tidal currents, it will add to that. Right? So if you, that's something that we're going to be looking at soon is that additive effect.
So to build off of Mark's comment, I think this project is exciting because you insulation and, for a long shorelines help attenuate wave energy, which, is logical, but there's not been any quantitative information. Work is exciting, and build on that. I'm wondering if you could comment on some of the other project ideas that we've discussed.
Mm-hmm. Previously, we talked about the North Shore Park, where the docking. So we were going to, in both locations, we were going to redeploy and look at United Park. We also wanted to support installation of living shorelines off of Dillon. And we're going to be working with Mauricio Arias, who's a mini ADP, versus shallow water waves combination.
And did a wave study a couple of years ago with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and got a lot of pushback from the maritime transportation industry, the biggest wakes. And so it's going to be really interesting because the MacDill living shoreline is on the east side of the MacDill Peninsula, right adjacent to the ship traffic routinely. So that was the big question because pressure sensors. So we couldn't distinguish and reflected waves, wind waves versus we can say, okay, this much the wave energy is due to wind-driven waves, this much is due to ship wakes.
Mark, I've got a comment / question. For MacDill site, I know is pretty much natural shoreline. I don't think there's vertical surfaces on the east side of MacDill Air Force Base. It's riprap, right. And then at the southern tier, there's, well, not breakwaters, but offshore oyster reefs, and then mangrove, reflected wave that you would say at Philippi. A primary wave, I would think, in that. You alluded to this also, Steve. The wave signatures are a function of probably vessel speed, whether they're placement. In your picture up there, you had a sailboat, which is a non-planing hull. I think is going to displace a lot of speed,
right?
But compared to like a full displacement hull,
Yes,
slow speed is going to,
very.
certainly there's no displacement that Philippi Park would expect. Another question though I have is so this is the baseline data, and I'm just wondering if, I'm seawall on the backside of where that seawall, I'm sorry, where the living shoreline would be, and your sensor between those. I'd be curious to see what that reflected wave energy, I think everybody would agree, would probably be significantly less in areas of tidal marsh and mangroves as compared to just the vertical surface. And for me, to see what the seagrass recruitment into that, the backside of that living shoreline. I mean, in some instances, I hate to say this publicly, but sometimes we've looked at where there's a no, I guess, influence of the wind, what have you, and the water would actually help accentuate that area on the backside recruitment of seagrasses. There's a big project up off North Carolina that was done, the replacement of a bridge, I think, that for mitigation, there were not a lot of options, and they put in a living shoreline. That stripped the wave energy and allowed for recruitment of seagrasses. Snorkel when you go to.
Are going to be passing that pass by McDill. There's a lot of the wave effects here, right? This mini tsunami effect, or the water.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So the water gets drawn out, and then it comes
Surges back in there.
That's a new thing that.
So I was just wondering, about days with small craft affecting. Did you see differences at all with your baseline on a day like today where it's pretty calm out there?
I mean, we did not look at the changes in count or. I would do that. For days that have small craft. But we haven't done that. That's a good idea.
I was wondering how that would affect the analysis, understanding of the energies.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if there was any during the time of point. So one thing that the industry has pushed back. It's not just what's the storms, and we've seen some very destructive boat wakes here, and you can go on YouTube and see a whole bunch of them as well. But there's been no real quantification of, say, a hurricane, or even some of these the frontal passages. So that's just what we'd like to capture.
And could I ask you to clarify your comment? I agree with what you're saying. What I don't understand is, was your question based upon a reduction in, say, vessel usage in small craft conditions, or was it wind-generated wave because it's so windy?
I was thinking that knowing which days were small craft advisories, those would be windy days.
Agreed.
By definition. Yeah. So you could use, you could just use the information from the weather people to say, oh, that was a windy day, and windy days are going to be different than calm days, I would think, on your baseline. But then I'm just, I'm not the scientist looking at
right.
I'm just the person out on the water.
Yeah, I'm not that smart either. I'm not either, but I don't understand that. But my comment is, more than I do for sure. But my question, I think, for Steve and maybe Mark is that are wind waves generated differently than wakes? They are because it's more surface driven rather than the displacement of the whole water column. Is that?
Yeah. Wind waves are very different in their generation characteristics. They tend to be more consistent over a really long area or wide area or fetch.
And they're
And, you know,
inexorable, sort of.
the statistics are very different. It's easy to, you just look at the top squiggly line there and say, oh, yep, that's a boat wake. Oh, those are wind waves.
Right.
That's a boat wake. And the generation process is very different.
And then I apologize if
No,
I
no, that's-
seemed off. I didn't mean.
Oh, no, absolutely. I'm just trying to understand this myself, so.
And part because it's so sheltered, windy days don't have a big effect unless the wind's coming from the south. And on those days, we did see a pickup in the wind.
Yeah, if you go back to the nautical chart, you can see clearly that the shoreline there, we're adjusted to the north of the Temple Mountain, and the maximum fetch is straight to the north. And so that's why you see the most wave energy coming from the north. By the way, the direction on those plots, the DWASP plots that Steve was showing are degrees counterclockwise from due east, because physicists measure things in the ocean and not compass degrees. So.
Understood. Do I have a quick question? One more? There's one more. Go ahead.
About how the waves impact the shoreline and washing out sediment. Have you looked into that? Like, I'm just thinking, mangroves could create sediment, but if there's a lot of waves that could be washing out the accretion, like how does that impact these with sea level rise?
We have not looked at that yet. So far, we've only looked at regions with the seawall. The installation is going to be later this year, next year, maybe. Fingers crossed. And then we'll get a more direct measurement. But it's interesting at this site, even though this is an unprotected seawall, and it's been there for decades, there's not a lot of scouring. So whatever is going on there, it needs a little bit more work to really understand. But either somehow it's being replenished, or it's just not. Yeah, you can see a little bit of scour right against the seawall, but it's just a few centimeters. That's it.
So I had a quick question. You mentioned earlier, Steve, about boat wakes being related to tidal currents. Can you speak on that? Like, say a vessel's stemming a current, well, a knot and a half, versus going with the current. Does that affect the wake as well, to your knowledge?
Yeah, it's going to affect the propagation of the wake. So if you're, for example, if you're in still water,
right,
you're moving, right, then the wake is going to propagate in its classic formation, depending on water depth and speed. And if the current is coming at you, with you, then your relative speed changes. Right? So then it affects the amplitude of the wake.
Makes sense.
Relative speed. Relative speed. Oh. Steve.
Just like a plane.
Physics.
I think we need to move to our speaker. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone, for the good questions. Our next speaker is Dr. Kara Radabaugh from Florida Wildlife Research Institute. And she is going to update us on the latest round of critical coastal habitat testing.
Thank you for the invitation to be here today. So I'm going to be presenting some preliminary survey results from the data that we collected last year. But this project, we're still in the midst of writing the report, so I am really interested in all of your feedback and questions, because we can use some of your ideas to help with the data analyses for the reports. So as a bit of background on this project, the Tampa Bay Estuary Program has a Baywide restoration plan that establishes habitat acreage targets based on habitat trends in the bay. And so restoration efforts can focus on priority habitats that we are losing in proportion to other habitats in the bay. So the data used to help make these decisions are based on a couple of spatial scales. On the Baywide spatial scale, they're examining changes in land use and land cover from the Water Management District maps. And then on the finer spatial scale, this is where the critical coastal habitat assessment comes in. So this is a long-term monitoring program designed to assess changes in coastal habitats due to sea level rise, climate change, and other anthropogenic impacts. So this project was started in 2015, and the original 5 sites are shown here in the black stars. So these black stars, these are all coastal wetlands that have minimal disturbance in Tampa Bay. This was, these sites were completed, the data analysis was completed by Atkins, and then FWRI, we completed 4 sites in 2016, but we also worked closely with Atkins to make sure that the methods were similar. And these 4 sites that we added in 2016, these were all restored coastal wetlands. Another round of monitoring was completed in 2018 by ESA. And then just last year, the FWRI Coastal Wetlands Group, we worked on streamlining the methods, and we completed an analysis at all 9 sites again. And the idea is that we're going to keep revisiting these sites every 3 to 5 years in perpetuity. So we have transects established at all of these 9 sites. They start at the water's edge, and they go all the way through a variety of coastal wetland habitats, all the way into the uplands. And along these transects, we are recording data on and density, elevation. So we have elevation along the transect. We are recording information on the pore water depth. Sometimes it's very deep area, salinity of the pore water. We're also collecting soil samples and looking at elevation. So we're using a white feldspar clay here, and then this was established in 20. And now we can go back and take a little and look at how much soil has built up on that white clay. We're also collecting soil samples to look at grain size and organic matter contents, as well as collecting data on faunal abundance, including. So there is a training manual and video available online through the Tampa Bay Estuary Program library websites, as well as a plan, and the project reports from 2015 and 2016 are all available online. So as a schematic of what these transects look like, we have one main transect going from the water's edge all the way to the upland. Along this transect, we're surveying elevation indicated by the white arrows. And then we also have quadrats that we place along the transect where we are recording the basal cover of all plant species. For trees, we've modified the methods a little bit this year, and we're using a belt in order to capture density. Smaller trees are measured in smaller area, and then the very largest trees are measured in a belt transect. That's a larger area. It's a lower density of the larger trees. We also have randomized that were established as 3 perennial vegetation zones. So these vegetation zones, they're just dictated by the generally pretty obvious changes in vegetation. For example, mangrove to salt marsh. And then at one location per zone, we are also recording a soil sample and so these were all established in 2015, 2016, based upon what the zones were like at that time, but a lot has happened since then. So last year, when we were out completing the surveys again, we did record what the zones look like today. So for instance, mangrove zone expanding, recording what it look like. The data that I'm going to present here, because that's a good species-specific density occurrences. So I'll talk first on mangrove expansion. Around the most common path I see mangroves growing, and then just further inches in the salt barren. There is a dynamic interaction between mangroves. That when the mangroves come in and grow, they shade the salt marsh plants and outcompete them. However, if there's cold events for cause mortality, we're talking around the mid-20s. Gotten temperatures quite that cold along the bay in Tampa Bay for quite a long time. So there have not been extensive cold event mangrove die-offs in Tampa Bay for quite a while. So we have seen a lot of mangroves. They were salt marsh down. 3/4 of Tampa Bay coastal wetlands were salt marshes in the 1800s, but now that majority mangroves, and that the lack of cold events. The reason why mangroves are expanding, and that's due to sea level rise. Is the influence of sea level rise, because we have not had a significant cold event in the So addressing mangrove expansion first, we did not see little to no mangrove expansion. So these relocations, we saw either no mangrove expansion or just a little bit. Hidden Harbor that didn't have a mangrove zone at all. So there were 4 notable mangroves. So these 4 transects had 16 to 30 meters of additional mangroves along the. So shown here in, these are the locations where new 1526 near on the property. So depending on how you count it, 80 and 90 meters of mangrove expansion along the transect. It does go back and forth between junctions. And one of the reasons we're mangroves, but also are growing in along the. There were mangroves already down here and here that just filled in from the north and the south, and from all sides we have mangroves growing in this transect. So mangrove zones and divide them into high expansion mangrove sites and low mangrove expansion sites. We can compare the sites. So for instance, salinity. When comparing salinity at the high mangrove expansion sites and low mangrove expansion sites for the 2 years at the phase 1 and phase 3 of these surveys, there's not a significant difference in salinity between these 2 types of sites. But a salinity of 56, this is in the pore water. This is hypersaline, so this is kind of what we see in salt barrens as well. So mangroves are quite tolerant of high salinities, and so they break out onto salt barrens and they're not really hindered too much at this range of salinity. So salinity was not holding them back at these sites. The bar graphs I'm going to show is all going to be mean across the sites, plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So another way we compare data at these sites is looking at elevation. So for this comparison, I'm looking at elevation in 2015, 2016 for the mangrove zones, and then 2023 new mangrove zones. So for instance, this bar is representing. And there's really where the mangroves are growing in, it's very similar to where mangroves were already occurring in 2015, 2016. But then when I look at the low mangrove expansion sites, first off, significantly higher elevation for these mangroves. But then to the area, to the adjacent zone that did not by mangroves. So think of this as the mangrove resistant zone. It is not a group. However, the difference between areas in difference between so it's this jump elevation that's keeping the mangroves in check for now. Just with the raw data. Elevation to the upland zone. Right here, this is where the new mangroves grew in. And it's really a very similar elevation to where mangroves were already growing. Then here at Weeden Islands, it's a bit slope throughout the mangrove zone, and that slope continues in the salt barren zone. The mangroves do stop at a very similar elevation, so this is 0.4 meters. This is NAB this site. That's where we see the mangroves stop growing for now. A gentle slope. I would be surprised if we start seeing mangroves grow in there during the next future round of CCHA, but we're not seeing it quite yet. So there's a lot more out here than just mangroves. At least the coastal wetland world, mangrove expansion is a really big topic. But the salt barrens are also changing. Cockroach Bay transect again. And here in this image from 2016, this is where the salt barren occurred along our transect. In 2023, this area was completely filled in by mangroves. Another line of mangroves here that was also present during the original monitoring. But this salt barren has now shifted inland, and it's taking over the high marsh sites. So this is a photograph of what it looks like on the ground. So a lot of the plants are dying off in this really high salinity salt barren area. And even the marsh that does remain, you can even see in the satellite image, is getting pretty scraggly and area due to the salt contents from water that comes in and then evaporates and leaves behind salts. And the species composition is also changing at this high salt marsh. So it does different than it did in 2016. However, some of the sites, salt barrens are in the same place, and the species composition, just anecdotally, haven't done the analysis yet, it did look very similar to the 2015 and 2016. So it's kind of, some sites were seeing big changes, other sites were not. So what isn't changing? We're not seeing loss of mangroves. We're not seeing loss either at the shoreline, loss when we won't necessarily start at the shoreline. So mangroves, they get stressed out by too much inundation too frequently. So in the first, tidal creeks, for instance, it's whatever is getting the most standing water, it will be the most stressed out. We're not seeing that yet in any of these transects. The transition to upland, so just shown here by this line, this is holding strong at all of the sites. So we're not seeing salt tolerant vegetation moving into upland at this point in time. So this means that the zones in the middle here, which are generally salt marshes, these are the ones that are experiencing the most coastal squeeze, because the mangroves are expanding, the uplands are holding their ground, and those salt marshes are experiencing the most loss. To put this in perspective for sea level rise, from 2015 to 2023, local sea level, so this is just pulled off of local sea level increased 7 centimeters during this millimeters per year. To the type of the feldspar marker horizons. This is what they look like here when we first deploy the feldspar, and just see the poles, and then we take out a sample of sediment and see how so these are their highest, they are lowest. average rate is around 4 millimeters per year. So this is still lower than the 8 millimeters per year, but we need to acknowledge that change also occurs below this feldspar horizon, in roots and pushing up the surface of the soil and building peats. So the total elevation change is not entirely captured by feldspar marker horizons. So this sea level rise graph is also pulled from the NOAA website for St. Petersburg. Intermediate scenario shown here in red, it's around 1.1 in 2100 or 2.1 through the high scenario. Scenario for now of a meter of sea level rise. These transects, they only have 1 meter of elevation total. It's very shallow. I mean, even the 8 centimeters of sea level rise, that's a lot for a mangrove because it affects how much inundation they have. So these are all of what things will look like. These are the areas that are all underwater immediately. So this is why having area for these habitats is important. So they need these undeveloped or softer developed and migrate further upland. We can't move. But we're not seeing any switch yet of these salt tolerant plants moving into uplands. So it will take some time for the plants to adjust to that step in order to fully start migrating. Preliminary conclusions here. The coastal wetlands response to sea level rise, it does vary widely by site. It has to do with elevation and slope along the sites. This is all driven by elevation, as this dictates inundation, which in turn dictates what. So these mangroves are expanding, salt barrens are inland, and the salt marshes are changing in composition, but we're not yet seeing a shift in the upland vegetation. And coastal squeeze, it's a major factor, especially for salt marshes in Tampa Bay. Those are the most at this point in time. And of course, the landward migration, it's restricted by urban developments, what roadways and elevation are present at each site. So SWIFMA, they are conscious of that fact in the restoration sites that they're creating. For instance, over upland migration. So this is cockroach undeveloped upland habitat that's available for null areas in Tampa Bay. So in addition to all the co-authors, Bay Estuary Program, we had a lot of volunteers and people come out and help. A lot of members of TBEP came out on different days. A lot of land access partners throughout the Bay. And of course, we're over the years, so many thanks to the cast funding for this project. And I'd love to hear your feedback because we haven't finished this report yet, so we can start incorporating any feedback. So say mangrove areas, but the species that are growing in the new mangrove areas might drive an overall species composition types of species there. So let's see what the species balance is between the new mangrove.
The mosaic River Mangrove?
It is right, located right here, so on the north
Yeah, I
side.
can't tell. It's on the north of the. You recall they did a big restoration project in Hurricane Francis spill, the channels through the mangrove there that had been sealed up the Alafaya River. So I wondered if that might have been responsible for increase in.
So this was not on the restored area. It was within the national. And I really think this is driven by the fact that it's a line kind of circles.
The extreme high levels on that same plot, the amplitude of those has gone up even more than those extremes that inundate areas and probably intolerant vegetation, like in my. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not just the mean sea level rise, but the change in those extreme inundation events.
Those extreme high sea level events during tropical storms. It probably depends on if we happen to sample soon after where the fast growing vegetation, if it has time to recover or not, if we would capture that. We would capture it in the trees, because those take a long time to develop, but we might not necessarily capture it in the smaller vegetation if it's been a year after that event and it's had time to regrow.
I was just wondering, it may be too early to, have this information yet, but are there different marsh species that are, I guess, more resilient to this expansion than others?
I think we do have the data to answer that. I haven't analyzed it yet, but I'm going to try to take a guess. I think a lot of it, we often have the pattern being mangrove, salt barren, high marsh. So in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily mangrove overtaking high marsh, it's mangrove overtaking salt barren and then salt barren overtaking the high marsh. So I think a lot of what we're seeing in the loss of species in the high marsh has to do with salt tolerance of those species. And just based on what we were seeing at Cockroach Bay, for instance, what was left was mostly the column and Ray Jacksonia seemed to be most common of what was left. But I think if we compare those sites where we're seeing the salt barren encroaching, we will be able to tease apart what are the most salt tolerant species in the high marsh and how do they change over time. So I think we'll be able to answer that. We just haven't done the analysis yet, but that's a good idea.
That's what I figured, so I'm excited to see the results of that.
It seems like your big loser is going to be Spartina alterniflora, because that's the low marsh species that's going to get overtaken first by the mangrove. I'm intrigued though by the juncus. So you got me thinking, because my question was going to be about rainfall, and maybe how much you think rainfall might be playing into this shift from 2015 to 2023, and not so much at a regional level, but more from a drainage or a flow pattern. Like a runoff pattern within each of these sites. But then, we start talking about the salt barrens or the salt terns. And I think, because when I think about juncus, I tend to think about it as being kind of a bit more of a brackish, more of a fresh, it's more on the fresh side than like alterniflora or even Spartina patens for that matter. But they tend to exist adjacent to those salt terns or those salt barrens. So I'm not sure how much of a role freshwater inflow might be playing in keeping those juncus marshes more intact and fending off that invasion, if you will, of mangroves. So I don't know. I was just curious what your thoughts are on how rainfall might be impacting, or freshwater inflow might be impacting these distributions.
So first, your comment on Spartina and alterniflora is entirely true, and the fact it's already lost. So that's why we don't have a lot of data on it. The mangroves have already taken over the Spartina zones. We only had 2 Spartina alterniflora zones. One of them is still there, just barely, and then one of them is entirely gone, wiped out by mangroves, and the rest didn't have any alterniflora at all. With the comment on juncus, Absolutely. So these areas where we do see a lot of salt marsh remaining in Tampa Bay, these are the Juncus marshes here in Little Manatee and Manatee River. And yes, they're more common in the freshwater environments. And actually, the one site that we didn't see a mangrove zone at all, it's still a Juncus marsh holdout, where there's a couple mangrove trees, so maybe 5 years will happen, but it's not there yet. So we are seeing those occur along the Juncus marshes, especially in of these rivers. So how much salinity is driving it versus sea level rise, and we haven't been having the cold events to keep the mangroves in check. I would say it's more on the side of just there's nothing keeping back the mangroves, and they're tolerant to a wide range of salinities, including fairly fresh salinities as well. Yes, Marcus.
So just to bring it back to how you contextualize this work, you talked about the fine scale CCHA surveys on the ground, very detailed assessments, but then the larger sort of aerial coverage assessments that we use, the SwiftMud maps to track the coverage of different habitats. And so that speaks to our habitat master plan that plays into this as well. That, you know, we talk about total intertidal wetland coverage, right, which includes mangroves, salt marsh, whether it's Lahaina or Juncus, and then salt barrens. And so the tack that we've been using as a program is to say that, oh, mangroves are doing fine, right? There's not much we need to do. And I guess I kind of have 2 points / questions to make with that is that, you know, we don't need to help mangroves now, but I think you pointed out rightfully in the future that at some point we might start seeing mangroves being lost, okay? You know, whether that's there's nowhere for them to expand or some other cause. But that's an important point to make, I think, is that they're doing great, but we can't necessarily expect that to continue to happen 20, 30, 40 years from now. Regarding salt marshes, you know, when we look at total intertidal wetland loss, you know, it's declining as a whole in our watershed. And that is the result of basically the salt marshes being lost or being overtaken by mangroves. Is there any hope at all for salt marshes in terms of like where we can go to look for restoration sites, you know, places that aren't going to be inundated with mangroves or where they can expand? Because I lack appropriate guidance to tell, you know, our restoration community about salt marshes. You know, we kind of just say there's really not anything we can do. And so I'm just curious, in your opinion, is there a glimmer of hope for salt marshes? And you kind of talked about it with Chris's question, but.
I would say having a gradual elevation that continues upslope would help the salt marshes. And that would help them easily migrate upslope and not having that big step that often occurs because that's when they get squeezed out. But if it's more of a gradual slope, that would facilitate them migrating inland as well with sea level rise.
And Marcus, remind me that when in the master plan with respect to salt marshes, it doesn't differentiate between like more freshwater, you know, kind of transitional marshes. It's just salt marshes and salt marsh, right?
Generally, yeah. So it's just this broad category, but we do emphasize, you know, the low salinity areas where Juncus can be. We don't have technical targets or goals for Juncus versus Spartina, but we are cognizant of the fact that there's differences in where those sites could be located based on salinity in the soils.
So I think to that point, you know, when you talked about basically alternative flora is kind of a lost cause at this point, unfortunately. I think your point's exactly right on with respect to like looking at how do we better, you know, set ourselves up for resiliency in the future. It's making sure that, you know, that one diagram you showed where you had basically rock and a road, those are the areas that we really need to look at and where there's opportunities to do things like living shorelines or just to make sure that there's not just a wall. That's going to help that those Juncus, more kind of brackish marshes will have an opportunity to migrate inland as the seas continue to rise. So maybe that's the way to look at it from a restoration standpoint. You know, where can we maybe soften the shorelines? allowed that migration to happen.
And for what it's worth, we do have, one of the products coming out of the HMP is a restoration potential map that shows if you are to select different sites, what is the most likely habitat you should shoot for. And that's like a first cut, right? Of course, you do have to go to these particular locations and say, well, is there, hard infrastructure there that's gonna prevent this? But we do provide these types of tools that is facilitating the process in some way, but.
And to your point, we've been incorporating that concept in our restoration plans for decades. But the problem is, like for Cockroach Bay, within our restoration footprint, we incorporate those changes, but ultimately you're gonna hit 41. I mean, there's a point where you're gonna get off your restoration site and hit a highway or a development, and that's where, what do you do once that happens?
Just to add to the conversation, this is Ed online. Can you guys hear me?
It's like the great voice that comes
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, just to chime in terms of the differentiation between sort of the more saline marsh versus oligosaline marsh that occur within the region. I think it also boils down to sort of the scale of assessment, because traditionally the land use maps, even for mangroves, were classifying Spartina marshes all the way going back to the past within the mangrove complex. So you kind of have that bias just in the land use land cover information, but that isn't to say that there's an opportunities through this restoration opportunity assessment that Marcus was talking about, to use that as a strategy to restore certain high marsh habitats for the benefit of the long-term transition to mangroves. And we've seen that as a restoration practice in the past for certain sites in terms of Spartina plantings along the main Bay coastline. So it isn't to say that we should abandon, the notion that we can't restore Spartina. It's just our expectation of what that long-term habitat complex might be in the future would be probably different based on some of these results.
I agree, Ed, but I would also say that if you go back and we've done this, I think Mark Walton had given you guys a presentation about our reassessment of old habitat restoration projects. And, in so many instances where we planted Spartina alterniflora or Peytons, it's all mangrove now. So that, just happened, which is fine. I mean, for us, a large part of why we plant is to make sure that the soil stays where it's at. And even if it's paspalum or something else that just comes in, we know eventually succession is going to take over and those mangroves are going to come in. So yeah, I agree. I don't think we should abandon the idea of actively planting Spartina, but with the realization that ultimately they're transition to mangrove.
Right.
Thank you, Ed. I agree as well. And I also wanted to add with Marcus's comment about mangroves doing fine in Tampa Bay. In terms of acreage, yes, they are, for sure. But there are already areas in Tampa Bay where we do see areas of stress. And this is often in places where roads are blocking water flow and we messed up the hydrology due to ditching, whatever reason. And we often see these areas become a problem after another major stressor rolls in, like a hurricane, because these are the areas that die off after the hurricane and have a lot of trouble recovering. And so that's kind of the trend that we're seeing down in Charlotte Harbor following Hurricane Ian. The areas that were hydrologically stressed are really struggling after the hurricane. So we're doing fine for now, but there's still a lot of areas of vulnerability in Tampa Bay for a number of mangrove forests.
For the sea level piece, when you're looking at like the projections for mean sea level, that's often in the mean sea level datum, like vertical elevation datum for mean. But all of the elevations that you're comparing to are NAVD 88. So I think if you're gonna start to get into future sort of elevation comparisons between mean sea level projections, I would consider converting those NAVD 88 datums to mean sea level datum. And that way you can actually leave that out. To Mark's point, I think looking at the mean sort of high water events too is important. That's probably what's driving that. Cool to see the transition of salt bound up and probably what's driving that. So just a thought for consideration is that it's two different teams. So,
Related that in the last round of CPHA sea level was in past times. I just didn't have time with this presentation, so I just went with a meter of water is going to cover most things here. We only have a meter of elevation.
yeah, it's only a few, I forget, it's like 2 centimeters different here.
We'd be happy to help you with that, because that's kind of what we do.
Yeah, it's a good thing to include in the report. I agree, because we can show where sea level was in 2015, where it is now, and where it's heading. That would be useful to include.
I think it's also useful to point out that fauna is also moving with this process and that they can also shape the ecosystems. We had a couple sites where there were signs of fog space. And then in some of the sites where we had a lot of cracks, we found that the salinity was actually a little bit lower. And so we don't know, like, schools were holding rainwater or something like that. But there's a lot of interactions between the fauna and the flora in these areas that are considered.
Sure.
I just wanted to make one more point. Kara's doing the big changes between the first sampling, but we also have an intermediate sampling that we can also look at. So we could potentially look at changes in, say, the rate of change between like 2015 to 2018, 2018, 2023. So the tax comments on, whether you think that would be useful for us to incorporate in a report or manuscript coming out of this.
Let's take a quick 5-minute break. I know everybody's been drinking coffee, so we're sitting here for an hour and a half. So please come back like right around the bottom of the hour. Extra, and we'll get on to the next one. We've got to pick up our pace a little bit. This is great dialogue. I love it, but we're going to run out of time with all the presentations. So long, that just means.
As soon as,
Yeah.
see, yeah.
As
soon as the mangroves get yeah, they're so dense. It's can't.
Yes, sir.
Actually, you know what?
Yeah, that's a little bit misleading.
Money more post monitoring besides just counting birds and
is a participatory science living shoreline guidance. Sheila?
Sorry, I lost.
Nate did it.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Sheila Scalaro. I'm the Community Program of Bay Estuary Program. So basically what I do at the Estuary Program is I coordinate all of our tier events, and I'm working with our technical staff to try and expand our participatory science or citizen science monitoring programming. So today, I just want to bring to you guys this project we've been working on with Tampa Bay Watch, and it's a participatory science living shoreline monitoring program. So really, I just kind of want to let you guys know that this is out there, gauge your interest in the project or in the program, and elicit some feedback on the methodology. So as I mentioned, we've been working on this with Tampa Bay Watch. So they were really the lead on this project. And it was part of a Bay Mini Grant project. So they were awarded around $5,000 to develop this program. So if you're not familiar with the Bay Mini Grant program, it's an opportunity for organizations like yourselves to be awarded up to $5,000 for projects that protect and restore Tampa Bay. So this is a really great funding source if you have like an idea that you want to pilot or a smaller restoration project that you want to get accomplished using some volunteers. All of the funding that comes through this program is from the Tampa Bay Estuary Specialty License Plate or the Tarpon Tag. So if you don't have one, you should get one. Also, just thanks to Tampa Bay Watch staff for carrying like the brunt of developing this project or this program, and especially to Paige Lansky and Rick Radigan, who really carried the brunt of the work. So over the past several years, we've seen this major focus on these living shoreline restoration projects around the watershed. However, after project implementation, there's pretty limited long-term monitoring to see how effective these habitats are at emulating or native habitats and how these habitats change over time. And really some of the barriers to that traditional monitoring is lack of funding or limited staff time or limited staff bandwidth. So citizen science or participatory science is quickly becoming a tool in the scientific community. Scientists are using to help fill some of these data gaps and answer these environmental questions. So citizen science or participatory science is really the engagement of trained community members in the data collection process. So when we were originally chatting with Tampa Bay Watch, we felt that using participatory scientists really made sense for these living shoreline monitoring projects. And that's really because, you know, it's volunteers that primarily carry the brunt of actually restoring and in. So by including them not only in restoration or installation, but also in the monitoring of these sites, you really instill this sense of environmental stewardship. You start to build environmental ambassadors and really community members to start to take some ownership over these different sites. So it really requires less funding for the organization by using citizen scientists, and it's also a lot less burden on the staff. So the main goals associated with this participatory science living shoreline monitoring program were to evaluate shoreline performance over the long term. This currently, as it stands, is very focused on Tampa Bay Watch restoration projects, but as I'll talk about a little bit later, that could potentially be modified. Also
the goals of this monitoring program are to assess the effectiveness of different methodologies and different techniques that are being used so that we can adapt and refine those methodologies moving forward. We want to track long-term habitat changes in response to climate change, sea level rise, and just natural habitat succession. And then, of course, we want to engage the community, start to build some environmental ambassadors, and really instill a sense of ownership within the community. So anybody who knows or has been doing living shoreline restoration work, you know that there are a ton of different techniques that you can use. So this project focuses specifically on 3 shoreline methodologies. So coastal emergent vegetation restoration, oyster shell bag installations, and oyster reef ball installations. And the reason why we focused on those ones is because those are primarily the techniques that are used in the San Bay watershed. So coastal emergent vegetation restoration is pretty simple. It's usually done on the landward side of any oyster installations that are done. It's typically the species that are planted are Spartina, Juncus, or some herbaceous species. Oyster shell bags, I think most of us are very familiar with these, but if you're not, they're basically like a plastic mesh bag that's filled with recycled oyster mulch. And then finally, the oyster reef ball domes, worms, I think they sometimes call them. These are like hollow domes that have holes on the top and at several places on the sides. So to ensure the success of our volunteers, this SOP is broken up into several main components. It includes full checklists of all the materials that volunteers will need while they're out on a field day. And it also includes field considerations to ensure that volunteers primarily important when they are doing like oyster monitoring, which can be kind of dangerous. In addition to those, we also have guidance and step-by-step procedures on how to actually set up a data sheet and the step-by-step field procedures for actually collecting the information. And then we also include links to helpful ID guides for different plants and animals that our volunteers might see when they're actually in the field. I know some of you, like Kara, you guys might have really good IDs, so if you're willing to share those with us, that would be awesome. But really an essential component to this is the actually training the volunteers. Participatory science and citizen scientists are always trained volunteers, so you have to go through some sort of training. So with this, we would require an in-person training event for anybody who wants to participate in the monitoring program. And so during that training event, we would actually go out and survey a restoration site. It would be done alongside trained staff, and it would be an opportunity for the volunteers to gain hands-on experience with the methodologies, and also an opportunity for them to ask questions or ask for clarification and things like that. So as part of this program, volunteers will go out and collect information on site vegetation, sediment characteristics, oyster recruitment, as well as water quality measurements. So this is kind of just a general schematic like what I think of when I think of a living shoreline. I 100% understand that this is not all living shorelines look exactly like that, but this is kind of just a general outline. So for this project, or for this program, there are 2 different types of transects that will be surveyed. So the first are the vegetation transects, which are shown in red. Oh, sorry. So on this figure, the dark green is kind of like your upland species, higher elevation, and then the light green is your lower elevation, so your salt marsh. Followed that is your oyster bag section of open water and then some oyster domes. So the vegetation transects, there will be a minimum of 3 established at each restoration site, and they should span the whole length of the restoration site. These will run perpendicular to the shoreline. The clear shoreline isn't visible. They should extend from high elevation to low elevation. Also, we'll do 1 oyster transect over each one of the oyster sections. Your site has both oyster bags and oyster domes. You would have a transect over the oyster bags and a transect over the oyster domes. So the oyster transects run parallel to the shoreline, so they should be perpendicular to any vegetation transects. So for the vegetation monitoring along each one of the 3 transects, volunteers will survey 6 randomly selected locations along that transect using a 1/4 meter squared quadrat. Within that quadrat, the volunteers will record plant percent cover using general Grand Blanc abundances and plant condition. And then they will also include information on additional plant species that are there and different faunal species that are present. And then within a 10 by 10 centimeter squared quadrat, they will record 5 blade lengths and 3 shoot counts of the priority plant species. So the priority plant species would be the species like Spartino or the species that was originally planted at the location. And to ensure data quality, we are asking all of the volunteers to take a photo of each quadrat that will be sent to Tampa Bay Watch for later QA/QC by trained staff. Along the transects, volunteers will also do some soil monitoring. So they will measure sediment accretion along 3 elevation benchmarks. So at this point, we're thinking that we will be installing like poles during the restoration, and then the volunteers will measure the length of the pole that is exposed from the sediment. We will also have them include information or write comments about if there's erosion around the pole, or if it looks like it's kind of like being scoured out, or if there's any other issues associated with the pole. Also, at 3 fixed locations, the volunteers will also take a sediment sample. So that sediment sample will then be transferred back to Tampa Bay Watch and will be processed using loss on ignition procedures by trained staff. So that will help us understand how much carbon is being sequestered at these sites. So along the oyster transects, the volunteers will visit 3 locations, 3 random locations, and will, at each location, they will survey 2 quadrats. So 1 quadrat will be done on one side of the transect and the other quadrat will be done on the other side of the transect. So they'll be doing a total of 6 quadrats, but at 3 locations. So within each 1/4 meter squared quadrat, the volunteers will do counts of both live and dead oysters. They will do length and shell height of 10 live oysters, percent cover, so like an aerial coverage of the of live oysters within that quadrat, and then they'll also record any additional faunal species that are present. As similar to the vegetation monitoring, we'll also ask them to take a photo of each one of the quadrats for QA/QC. And then along the oyster monitoring transects, we'll also ask volunteers to collect some water quality monitoring measurements. So we'll ask them to collect pH, temperature, turbidity, and salinity. And really the reasons we chose those was because they're all collected using very simple equipment in the field. So you don't need like a big fancy hobo Gasant. So these are the resources that we've created so far. We have the SOP, field data sheets, and ID guides that I have on file. I'll also, once all of this is finalized, I'll include it on our TVEP dedicated website for all of our participatory science projects. But really the reason why I asked Marcus if I could talk to you today was I would really like a couple experts to review the SOP. So does it make sense? Does the methodology make sense? Kara, I'm kind of looking at you and maybe Ryan. I want it to be like, I want the information and the data collected to be useful, but I also want it to be simple enough methods that a volunteer can use it. So I'd love it if you guys could take a look at it, or maybe we have a more about. If you have any ID guides that you're like, these are my go-to ID guides, please send them my way. So obviously provide attribution to whoever owns them. But maybe I know there are a couple organizations in this room that are completing or have been doing some living shoreline restoration projects, and I really want to gauge your interest. Is this something that would be useful to your organization? Would it be beneficial for you if TVEP kind of stood up a living shoreline monitoring program where we had the training events, had access to the volunteers, stored the data, and then when you finish the project, you could come to us and say, hey, I'm ready for your volunteers, let's coordinate an event. So that's all I really had today. Like I said, very high level overview. The way that the SOP is written right now, it's very much tailored toward Tampa Bay Watch restoration projects. But if there was interest from the restoration community to modify that so that it's more applicable to all of these living shoreline projects that are going in around the watershed, then I would be happy to take that on and kind of round out this program. So that's all I have. I told you I'd be quick. Interest? Garbage? Yes.
I'm definitely interested in it, especially that last point, using these SOPs and stuff. Most of my living shorelines right now are in Cedar Key, working with private landowners. So having some sort of SOP to hand off to them and stuff to do their own monitoring and stuff would be really great.
Okay.
I don't have any in Tampa Bay right now.
Sure, but they're available to everybody.
Yeah, I'm definitely willing to. I think it'd be really useful for my program.
Awesome, thank you. Stacy?
We always appreciate a hand. SOPs, but you know,
Based off of what Rick has been doing.
right,
Based off of
technical, yeah, it would be great to have one kind of standardized method for the area.
Okay.
You'll see we tried a couple of different things, so you know, it'd be great to do mimic that.
Consistent monitoring outlines set up for all of them. Awesome, cool.
Do you plan on shopping this around at GomCon?
Do I plan on shopping around?
At GomCon next month.
I will not be attending GomCon, but I'm asking Carrie and she can shop it around. Right, Carrie?
On oysters, and there's a whole day on living, there's like a half a day on living shorelines. Be good group.
We have a bunch of people. Share it.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Spread the word. Good feedback. Yeah.
So so when and how will you distribute the SOPs for review? Just maybe an email to the group?
Yeah, so in the TAC follow-up, we can include a link. There's also a link for the SOP on the TAC agenda.
Gotcha. And what's your timing for feedback, you think? ASAP, I know.
February would be great.
Okay,
You
cool.
could input comments by the end of February.
Sure.
And just entering it as a comment is fine.
Are they PDFs at this point?
It's all like a Google Doc.
Okay. I'll take it.
I checked it out.
I will check it.
If you don't have access to and access a Google document, I'm happy to send it to you as a Word document.
And Sheila, so are you thinking you might annual training for citizens that are interested, and we'd have like a little core of trained volunteers?
Yeah, so I would maybe have a minimum of one training a year and to bring everybody who's doing the monitoring in on that day. So that everybody's on the same page, you know, it kind of builds like a learning.
Think that's what would excite to be visited by the volunteers.
That's a really great question. And that's something else that I kind of wanted to ask to the group. What makes sense? What is a reasonable timeline for monitoring?
So just speaking from previous in the oyster realm, we did a lot of our adult surveys quarterly. Snapshot of what was happening. I mean, their primary recruitment is, starting somewhere in the spring, ending late fall. So summer, fall, winter, you kind of get a snapshot of new recruits as well as adults later in the year and in the winter. That's just what I've done in the past. I don't know. There's also just like the semi-annual approach.
Yeah.
Spring and fall.
Yeah, I could see like a semi-annual, because we don't want to overburden the volunteers too, you know what I mean? So I think there's still a lot of answered.
I love the idea of working with like private homeowners, who maybe have a project, and I think maybe they could do the monitoring a little bit more regularly and submit that data versus a bigger project. You know, like out at Philippi, it's a huge issue, you know, it's like we plan to do something, it's like it's all underwater, we can't see anything. Kind of site based on the frequency.
I would say one lesson we learned while doing oyster monitoring tides, running up to the day of, you also check what the water level is in St. Pete, because based on the winds, the water can be a foot or two higher. And so we've had to cancel monitoring field days, with just short notice based on what the winds are doing.
Really good comment. Marcus.
So I'm going to out myself as not having read this yet, but and for posting the data that's collected from this effort in a centralized location.
Yes, it would all be hosted on our GitHub. Obviously.
Aside from the pictures for APC, and I'm assuming you'd probably be training, and it would be kind of like an audit, right? Or, just kind of methods and if they're getting the, but do you have any other plans, or are you personally gonna just solidifying the data?
Yeah, that's good. But one, we would do these training events similar to like how we do our seagrass monitoring training events. So to try and kind of get everybody and intercalibrate all of the teams. And then we wouldn't check every single photo. So we would do a percentage of the photos are being checked for QA/QC. And I would probably have like an intern help with that. But it's still, we're very much in development of this project. So those fine components of it still need to get ironed out. But that's a really good point. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Be sure to send.
Our next speaker is Marcus Beck from the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. Sort of insider plant, I think, because he's also meeting and
I get to side when you guys hear from me anytime you're in the meeting, so that's awesome. All right, so about this time every year, I give a presentation like this. I like to call this the vibe check for Tampa Bay. See how we're doing last year compared to all other years. Of course, this is a gross overgeneralization of all of the data sets and summaries that we do. It's meant to just give you a quick snapshot of things like water quality, seagrasses. In fact, I think on the agenda it was just water quality and seagrass transect results. But I'll be talking about all our other indicators that we have data for to present on today, like fisheries nectar index, benedict index, restoration projects, habitat report card, and hopefully get through all that in 20 or 30 minutes. So bear with me. Last time I gave this talk, I started with this slide here. I'm hoping that all of you are aware of this trend. Hopefully it's not news to you all, but I think it does kind of contextualize everything that we do as a program. Obviously, seagrasses, they are our bread and butter. They're not just good for the bay, but they are an indicator as a whole of how well the bay is doing. And so, of course, the elephant in the room is that since 2016, we've seen a continuous loss in the total coverage of seagrasses for the bay. Whereas, the last round of surveys we've had for the district in 2022, actually late 2021 is when these images were collected for these data. It was marking the third reporting period in a row where we saw a decline. So that's a concern for us, obviously well below our coverage goal. And you'll see here that for the longest period of time, we have 38,000 acres as our goal. And then because we're overachievers in 2020, we decided to up that goal to 40,000 acres. So this is a concern for us as a program. We want to make sure that we get seagrasses back on track. And of course, seagrasses are related to water quality, and that's basically what we're trying to do as a program. Just looking a little more closely, and again, I think you all are aware of these trends, but just wanted to highlight some areas of interest where we have seen these losses. These are the four major bay segments of Tampa Bay: Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, Middle and Lower Tampa Bay. And so where we saw most of these losses was, of course, in the Upper Bay segments like Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, somewhat Middle Tampa Bay. Lower Tampa Bay has historically been relatively stable, but just drawing your attention to these areas where we have seen most of the losses. Two things here. 2022 was the lowest estimate we've ever seen for seagrass coverage in Old Tampa Bay since we've been monitoring this. So that should, shock and disgust all of you. Hillsborough Bay also in decline, but note the differences in scale here. We haven't typically seen a lot of seagrasses in Hillsborough Bay in general, but the percent decline is quite large from the peak we saw in 2015. So these are areas of concern looking at the bay as a whole. So as I said, this is information that hopefully is not news to you all. What I do want to draw your attention to for this presentation is some of the trends we've been seeing in the Transect survey results. So those previous plots are from the we also have data that is collected annually. So these are 60 or so transects where our partners go out every year and run the transect and collect information on species presence, coverage, condition, all sorts of great things. And some encouraging news here. We do see a slight increase in total frequency agreements in this last dot being 2023. So that is encouraging news. I don't want to say that seagrasses are on the road to recovery just yet, but just pointing that out is that we are seeing a slight increase from the transect data that again kind of fills in that gap between the district surveys. Going back to a segment level breakdown, as I said, we did see most of the losses from the district maps in Old Tampa Bay and Hillsborough Bay, and that is also where we see most of the gains from basically 2016 to 2020. And a lot of that is actually driven by Haladuli, because that's, most of the seagrasses in that bay, those two bay segments are Haladuli. This total increase is a reflection of the Haladuli somewhat recovering. Now, we have a lot of questions of like why the seagrasses have declined since 2016, why they're kind of somewhat recovering in these bay segments, and I'll get into why we think that could be. But again, I just want to reiterate that although this is encouraging news, I wouldn't say that, we can step back and say, seagrasses are recovering again. Let's just, ignore them for now. So to talk about like why we think these recoveries are happening, I want to talk about water quality, because we know that the light habitats in the bay are going to be the primary drivers of seagrass growth, and the light environments are driven primarily by nutrients in the bay, how that handles to phytoplankton growth. So the water quality report card, that is something that we put out every year. I printed out a bunch of them that you have at the table there. Just note that this is a draft product at this point. The final one usually doesn't come out until February or March. And that's just because we use provisional water quality data from EPC for this draft product. I think at this point, Chris can correct me, but it's only the December data that are provisional at this point. And usually when we get the final data, it doesn't really change much. So you can expect the final product to look very similar to this. To orient you guys to the report card, kind of serves two purposes. The first side that has the red, yellow, green stoplight graphic, that's sort of our management focus side that looks at how the water quality changes as a function of chlorophyll and light attenuation, and that's meant to guide sort of how our partners are thinking about understanding drivers of water quality and how the bay could be changing as a function of that. And then the second side is more of a regulatory assessment. So we do have a TMDL in place for the bay, and we have criteria for chlorophyll concentration, and the graphic that you see there is just whether or not the different bay segments met the chlorophyll threshold for that given year. So about the management side, so the colors aren't just to say green is good, red is bad. There are specific management actions associated with each color. So they're meant to inform how our management community goes out and thinks about managing water quality. And there are narrative descriptions that go with each of those colors. And I like to point that out each time to emphasize that this is meant to be sort of actionable information. And in 2023, we were all green in the course for water quality, relating it back to that narrative. So good job, guys. The bay is healthy with water quality. We did good. There are, I think, some reasons why we saw good water quality this year. Remember 2022, we also had all green, and I'll talk about that in a second, but for the most part, water quality in 2023 was quite good. We were below the chlorophyll target for all bay segments, as well as the light penetration or light environment targets for all bay segments as well. So this is showing you the time series basically of the management outcomes, the stoplight graphic on the first side of the page. You'll see basically for the last 8 years or so, all of the bay segments have been green, with the exception of Old Tampa Bay, which has been in this yellow category, and that's primarily a function of chlorophyll target exceedances in that bay segment. So Old Tampa Bay is somewhat of the problem child that we are generally concerned about. We see a lot of the seagrass losses there, and some of those losses have been attributed to poor water quality in the bay segment. But again, as in 2022 and 2023, we had good water quality in that bay segment, and we do think that is somewhat contributing to the increase in seagrass coverage in that bay segment. Regulatory outcome, obviously very similar. Again, this is just whether or not the chlorophyll threshold was met, red or green. So in 2022, 2023, we met threshold both those years. Then going into some of the bay segment specific trends, we see these graphs are on the report card. This is just looking at the annual average of chlorophyll for the major bay segments. And we have, obviously this is showing the long-term recovery of the bay relative to chlorophyll concentrations, but we have these blue lines here that show our management targets and our regulatory thresholds. So the target is going to be this lower blue line, and then the thresholds are the upper dotted lines. And just to draw your attention to basically all the bay segments, but Old Tampa Bay in particular, you see that 2022, 2023, well below what it was in the previous years. And this is somewhat mirrored in the other bay segments. We saw basically the lowest, I did look at these numbers beforehand. I think in Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, and Middle Tampa Bay, this is the lowest annual chlorophyll concentration we've ever seen in 2023. So that's interesting, and I'll tell you why I think we saw that this year in a second. This is light attenuation, so obviously kind of following the chlorophyll trends, relatively high in recent years, but lower in 2022 and 2023. Not anything too surprising there. As I said, in Old Tampa Bay, the exceedances we saw that led to the yellow management outcomes and the chlorophyll threshold exceedances are a function of chlorophyll, basically. Light attenuation has been below the management target and the regulatory threshold for basically the last 10 years. But you see it does kind of track chlorophyll as well. And this is the seasonal breakdown. So we know that the annual average is not telling the whole picture. Typically when we see chlorophyll exceedances, it's during the summer months following the growing season. And the red points here are basically showing 2023 values within each month for each of the major bay segments. So again, basically everything is well below where it has been historically. And in Old Tampa Bay in particular, when we do see chlorophyll exceedances, it tends to happen in September, August, October period when we see basically pyrogenium blooms in Old Tampa Bay contributing to exceedances. Not saying pyrogenium has gone away in Old Tampa Bay. It's still there. Just wasn't particularly a large bloom this year. Okay, so why did we see really good water quality? We're looking at chlorophyll and light attenuation. Those are our main endpoints. We know that in the past, the targets and thresholds that we've defined for the bay segment are linked to basically how chlorophyll and light attenuation respond to nutrient inputs. So that is the primary paradigm we use at the SBIR program for understanding bay management. Lower nutrient loads lead to lower algae growth, leads to better water clarity or light environments for seagrasses, and then we see seagrass growth increase. That's been our primary paradigm for 3 decades. We're still holding on to that. That's obviously going to be how we continue managing the bay moving forward, but there are some other considerations to look at how, interannual variability and chlorophyll and light attenuation is driven and other factors that might be affecting exceedance or attainment of those different thresholds. As I said, pyrogenium continues to be a concern in Old Tampa Bay. We know that has led to exceedances in the past, not necessarily in the last 2 years, but it is still there. There's no signs of it going away anytime soon. But in particular, rain patterns are also significant drivers of changes in chlorophyll and light attenuation. So we know that historically, obviously, point sources, so wastewater treatment inputs, for example, were the largest sources of nitrogen in the bay, but now, in this present day, stormwater loads are a big contributor. So basically, anytime we have less rain, we see less nutrient inputs into the bay. And we know that 2023 was incredibly dry. So I got this information a couple days ago from district. So I'm curious how it looked for 2023. This is basically the watershed average in inches from 1975 to present. So basically when EPC started their water quality monitoring to now. And 2023 is, I believe, even lower than 1,000, incredibly dry year. And that somewhat mirrors the change in chlorophyll that we've seen, especially this year. Less stormwater inputs, less nutrient loads from rainwater runoff. That translated to lower chlorophyll A concentrations. Now, obviously, this long-term decline in chlorophyll is driven by essentially the reduction of point source inputs, but we know that now, as I said, stormwater nutrients are going to be the primary inputs of nutrients into the bay. So I think in this present day, water quality is much more driven by variation in rainfall as opposed to point source loads that are more or less regulated at this point. And then this graph on the right is just showing the relation of rainfall versus chlorophyll. So you can kind of see there's more rainfall, more chlorophyll we get. 2023 is all the way to the bottom left down here. This is not a particularly clean regression because we know that other things are affecting chlorophyll. Like for example, up here, we see some of the early years, these are kind of outliers. This is when chlorophyll is more driven by the point source loads, less a function of rainfall. But this is just to show that it is a lot of variation attributed to rainfall. And I do think that, 2023 being a dry year explains the water quality that we saw. So take home for seagrasses and water quality. The estuary program, we're hopeful that what we saw this year and the previous year is an indication of longer term improvements, but we know that managing for drought is impossible. We can't use drought as a management strategy, so we know that there's just going to be interannual variability, and we have to consider that when we're looking at attainment of targets and thresholds in the long run. We're obviously going to stick to our nitrogen load reduction efforts. That's always going to be something we do as a program. You know that point source inputs, as well as all the other sources of nutrients in the bay, are going to be the primary drivers. But other factors like rainfall or temperature or changes in salinity could be driving some of the finer scale interannual variation we're seeing in the bay. Just as a nod to that, I remember last year you guys probably heard a lot about the Old Tampa Bay Assimilative Capacity Study. That was an RFP we had out. We now have a contract in place. We're just now starting this work. And this study is meant to really do a deeper dive into what is driving some of those conditions we're seeing in Tampa or Old Tampa Bay. Again, we know that nutrients are going to be the main source, but there could be other things. And we think basically that the nutrient diet for Old Tampa Bay perhaps has changed from what it was in the past. And are there other factors we need to consider for managing that part of the bay and getting back on track? So this is going to be an annual or a one-year project towards the end of the year. Middle of the year, actually, we're going to have probably some interim product to show you as we sort of kickstart this effort. Okay, so that's water quality, seagrasses, take home, low rain, good water quality. Other factors, obviously, the bay is a complex ecosystem. We like to report on other indicators. Another product I talk about each year is the Nectin Index, and this is one where the data set is actually lagged a year. So in the beginning of 2024, I report on data for the previous 2 years ago, basically, so 2022. And what we saw this year, so just, some background about the Nectin. This is basically how the fisheries community, as well as some swimming invertebrates, respond to water quality changes and habitat degradation. So it's kind of just another line of evidence of how the ecosystem is responding to its environment. And in 2022, we had all of the bay segments as yellow. And again, these do have narrative associations with different colors. But basically, we hadn't seen all of the bay segments in yellow since 2008, okay? And I don't think anything really new happened in 2022. What I think, or I'm pretty sure what has happened is that in 2021, we saw a large drop, and this is just showing the time series for all the bay segments. If you remember 2021, I'm sure you didn't forget, this was when Piney Point release happened, and so we had that red tide event following Pine Point, and that knocked down the fisheries community quite a bit. And in 2022, it's still showing signs of recovery. So I think basically 2022 is just a lag effect of what happened in 2021. And in particular, 2005, this was another large red tide event in the bay. And as you can see, it took quite some time for the community to recover. So about almost 10 years. And so I'm not surprised that 2022, we're still seeing kind of this hangover effect, I guess. So that's Nectin. Another one to report on. This is another product where we get the 2022 data in 2023. And basically this is the benthic index, another highly summarized source of information compiling decades worth of information at multiple sampling stations. This is from EPC, and this is basically showing us how the biological organisms in the sediment are responding to the contaminants or pollutants that have accumulated in their habitats. Really, as far as 2022 goes compared to 2021, not really a huge change. As you can see, basically Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay have long been impacted parts of the bay, primarily because that's where we get a lot of our inflows, a lot of shipping activity, that kind of thing. But there hasn't been a lot of change over the last couple of years in these bay segments. And this index is going to be, I think, having a lot less interannual variability because it's a measure of how the organisms are responding to what's in the sediments. And that's not going to change a whole lot from year to year unless something drastic happens. So I'm not super surprised by these results. You could say that Hillsborough Bay is doing better, but that's sort of reading it.
Marcus, the benthic index is based strictly on faunal species.
All the little invertebrates that live in the benthos. Okay, so that's biology. We also like to report on its restoration efforts of all of our partners. So each year we get this massive summary of information from all of our partners that have done restoration projects, and we like to communicate that back to you all to show that basically, all the good work you guys are doing, but also how that relates to targets and goals under our habitat master plan. So this is just a summary of 2023 of all of the projects by our partners that was reported to us. So total projects on the left, total acres in the middle, and total miles of restored habitat by the major habitat types we track in our habitat master plan. This looks like an insane amount of acres of restored habitats, but I would just mention that we also track enhancement in addition to restoration. So what this reflects basically is area that has been restored but is sort of managed in a maintenance state, or controlled burns or invasive species removal, that kind of thing. It's not that we restored 30,000 acres of upland habitats. But this pattern is basically pretty typical, where most of our restoration projects in a given year go towards uplands. Not saying we should stop that, but it's just a function of basically what is available for restoration compared to the other habitats. And comparing that to previous years, this is just a pie graph breakdown of number of projects. Across all the different habitat types, we had 71 projects in 2023, almost double what we had in 2022. I don't remember why we had such a low reported effort in 2022, but we're glad to see that we're pretty much back on track to where we were in 2021. And again, upland habitats was the focus of most of the work. Pretty large effort in coastal uplands, so upland habitats in the coast. Non-forested freshwater wetlands received some attention last year. That's good. We have seen a lot of losses in wetlands over the years, so we like to see effort placed there as well. And then, so yeah, this is basically an inventory of the work that our partners have done. And the hope is that the work that they're doing translates to notable gains in acreage targets in our habitat master plan, okay? So we have basically this plan that was updated in 2020 that sets clear targets and goals for the native habitats in Tampa Bay that we'd like to meet to ensure that we're doing the work that needs to be done. And to kind of help in that effort, if you remember last year or maybe the year prior, we kind of developed this beta project or product rather that shows how well we're doing in meeting those targets and goals. So another kind of stoplight graphic that really depicts long-term trends in the different native habitats relative to where we want to be with the 2030 target and also the 2050 goals. So we have this color-coded graphic that kind of depicts that information. And the colors mean basically, first of all, is the target met for a particular native habitat? If it's met, it's either going to be dark green or yellow. In addition to just being met, we want to know how the trends have changed over time relative to are we going to meet or not meet that target. And so if we're trending towards meeting that target in 2030, it's going to be light green. If we're trending below, so we're not going to meet that target in 2030, it's going to be red. So keep that in mind when you look at these colors, that they define whether or not the target was met and how the trend has changed between the current year of data and the previous year of data. And I realize you could define that trend differently, but for this product, we defined the trend as current year and the previous year of data. So again, this is just meant to give you a high-level overview of how we're doing for our Habitat Master Plan targets in 2030. And we have the major habitats in the columns broken down by the different, what we're calling strata. So subtidal habitat below the mean tidal level, intertidal, and then supertidal up in the watershed. Right off the bat, you can see that, okay, looks like seagrasses are not doing great, as I explained. We're below our 40,000 acre target, and we're keeping that trend. It's not looking like we're going to meet that 2030 goal. Other things to talk about, this is basically the intertidal wetlands. We were talking about this earlier with some of Kara's work. We're seeing basically, this is the total of mangrove, salt barrens, and salt marshes. And you can see the trends individually. Basically, we're not meeting the target, and that's definitely a function of just losses of salt marshes. That's my question of what can we really do for making sure we're restoring or preserving salt marshes. Mangroves obviously doing good. Salt barrens improving as those habitats migrate landward. And then in the uplands, we are seeing some gains actually in non-forested freshwater wetlands, but we are continuing to see losses in forested freshwater wetlands. So that is a concern there. And also, yeah, so I didn't mention the numbers in each box represent the proportion of the target that is met in a given year. So above 1, we're meeting the target, or rather exceeding the target. Below 1, we have some work to do. Native uplands, let's see, the target is met for these, but we're trending in a direction that is not good. So basically, from this map, you can kind of develop some priorities for where you want to focus restoration effort. And we're kind of breaking these down into 3 different categories. Prioritize, so we need to really focus on these areas. Keep it up, meaning we're doing good. We may not be at the target yet, but the trends are looking good. And then doing fine, meaning they don't need a whole lot of attention. Not that they're unimportant, but they're probably doing fine just on their own. So priorities, obviously, seagrass, salt marsh, Spartina, Juncus, and then freshwater wetlands. We are not at the target for these, and the trends are not looking good. Keep it up. Oyster bars, I think, actually we're now above the target for oyster bars. We had some additional data sets that we brought in that added more information, and we're now above the 2030 target. But again, that's still going to be a priority habitat for us, because you know how important those habitats are for health of the bay. Uplands as well. Some of the trends are concerning, but we're not meeting the target for a lot of those, so we want to make sure we continue efforts there. That includes uplands in the watershed as well as those in the coastal fringe. There is a differentiation between those two in the Habitat Master Plan. That's strictly a function of how when we sea level rise is going to definitely affect habitats near the coast versus up in the watershed. And then mangroves. We've talked a lot about mangroves, so I won't belabor the point there. So that's it. That's the vibe check for 2023 State of the Bay. All this stuff actually you can find online on our website. We have an interactive web component, udp.org/State of the Bay, or I think it's estuary/State of the Bay. It's on there. You can do a much deeper dive into any of these high-level products, but I'd love to entertain some questions about this. Thank you.
I have a couple of thoughts about so first of all, the water quality data looks really good. I'm so glad to see, you know, of all the major bay segments, it looks like all but I think it was Lower Tampa Bay is at like an all-time record low for chlorophyll concentration, which is awesome. Yeah, so that's really, really good news to see that. One question and then one kind of maybe cautionary note. So the question is with respect to macroalgae, and you know, I think this underscores discussions we've had many times in the past on the need to really look at percent coverage of macroalgae. When you were looking at the Transect data, how did the macroalgae look relative to previous years that we did those Transects?
Yeah, I purposefully did not show macroalgae on these plots because I just wanted to focus on the three major SAB species. But you know, the conversations you and I, a lot of people in this room have had, is that macroalgae, its role as a primary producer, how it relates to SAV in terms of competition or nutrient source or sinks, response to eutrophication, a lot of questions around that. And we have seen trends in macroalgae that sort of are the opposite of seagrasses. So if you look at Old Tampa Bay, we've seen a lot of different species, but Caulerpa in particular has increased a lot in recent years. But if you look at this year, it's declined. So to me, it seems like there's sort of a successional change where the seagrass tends to decline, then you see an increase in macroalgae, whether it's the macroalgae that's causing the decline or it's just capitalizing on it, who knows. But then eventually the macroalgae tends to go away as I think it just sort of uptakes all the nutrients and sort of lives its life. But with the increase in seagrass, I would say that, yeah, the macroalgae is not on that same response this year.
I think what's interesting is if you look at the Caulerpa trends from 2020, so from 2018 to 2020 in Old Tampa Bay, we saw like this 4,000 acre increase in Caulerpa where we had seagrass prior. It was almost like a 1-to-1. In 22, we saw about a 2,000 acre loss in Caulerpa. And then recently, I guess I was out probably October, we saw a lot of Chaetomorpha. And I think you guys were reporting the same thing. I talked to Maya about that there's a lot of Chaetomorpha, and I'm curious, you know, are we seeing kind of that now peter out because there's just not a food source for them anymore? So now the competitive edge is shifting back towards seagrass.
Yeah, I don't know if Sheila has any comments about the Chaetomorpha.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, like, anecdotally, being in the water all summer, water clarity was amazing.
Yeah.
Like, especially in Old Tampa Bay. And we also did see a significant loss in Caulerpa again. So I think that in your most recent mapping, you'll also see that. But yeah, we also noticed this kind of like shift from like in places where there historically or over the past couple of years, we'd seen a lot of Caulerpa. Now is this Chaetomorpha. So kind of, which I think is worse. Like I'd rather see a Caulerpa than a Chaetomorpha, which is like this huge bundle of like drift algae that kind of just like smothers everything. So
one thing I find interesting though is like when you look at Chaetomorpha, you can buy that at the pet store because apparently it's really good for saltwater aquarium to really clean the water. And It's kind of interesting that, you know, we obviously the rainfall I think plays the majority of the role there, but it's kind of interesting. You've got Chaetomorpha coupled with a lack of rainfall, and the clarity is just awesome.
Yeah.
So it's kind of neat to see that.
There. The other thing I was going to mention is Old Tampa Bay. I mean, this upward tick in frequency occurrence, I think it's real. I don't know if it's indicative of a larger trend, as I was saying, but if you do look at with the transect data, this is summarized at the base segment level, but you can look at each individual transect, and we do have a dashboard where you can do that. But I was looking at the Feather Sound transect, and you can see that progression from year to year of seagrass decline, Callirpa increase, Callirpa going away, and then right at the beginning of the transect this year, you can see a little bit of Haladuli coming in. So it's ever so slight, and I think just this base segment summary is like an aggregate, obviously aggregate summary of all of the transects in each base segment. So I wouldn't say it's recovered, but it's.
Yeah, and along those lines too, my cautionary note is just similar to what I think we saw in Sarasota Bay in 2022, which is the grass, there's no doubt, I've seen it too. There is some Haladuli, maybe Rupia coming back in, but it may be at such low densities that we won't see it from the air. So, the numbers in the 24 numbers may not necessarily reflect what we're seeing on the transect because the percent coverage may be so low. We saw that in Sarasota Bay where, we didn't see any major increase. We didn't see any increase in Sarasota Bay in 22, but we knew there was recovery. Now you go out to upper Sarasota Bay and all that area above Lombard Point that had lost all that grass in 2020, it's back with a vengeance. I mean, those grass beds look gorgeous. So obviously we expect to see that in the imagery. So we may not be there in Old Tampa Bay yet, but I do think that, assuming things don't radically change from a precipitation standpoint or denuding blooms, I think we may be on the precipice of a recovery.
Yeah, and again, nothing really has changed between this year, last year, and the previous 10 years in terms of our management strategy. So just again, emphasizing the interannual variability and how it relates to rainfall in a lot of cases, and that what we've seen in the last 2 years is just a small blip compared to the last 10 years. And I think that I wouldn't expect the seagrasses to recover to what they were like in 2016 because nothing has really changed. The program has done a lot of great work. All of our partners, the entities that are responsible for, the allocations they're discharging, a lot of great work over the years. But going back to what I was saying about just the paradigm used as a program, there's other things in play in Old Tampa Bay that contribute to changes in the last 10 years. Irrespective of the previous 2 years, that I think are still there that we need to look at. And so I don't want us to lose any momentum towards how we're looking at Old Tampa Bay. I just want to encourage you all to look forward to some of the products of the Old Tampa Bay Assimilate Capacity Study this year that I think is going to be very enlightening.
Your graphs are interactive. How'd you do that in your presentation? What program is it?
I did that on purpose. I wanted you to see the interactivity. It's Quarto. It's document generation system used in it's all open source. I do open science trainings if anybody is interested. I actually did one recently at the surf meeting that's online if you want to check it out.
Should do a Quarto training.
Yeah, sure, we can. We are going to do a hackathon next year. That's the training for next year.
So Chris, when can we expect the release of the next maps?
So yeah, I was gonna talk about that in the open discussion, but I guess I can talk about it now. So we are actively acquiring the imagery now. It's been challenging given that we've been in an El Nino winter. So we've got some of the flight lines complete in Tampa Bay. We still have several more. So once the acquisition is complete, which we hope to do at the end of February, then we'll be completing the post-processing. We are looking for beginning of 25 as the official release of all the maps. Of course, we expect the draft maps to come out before then. Tampa Bay is our priority, and then kind of Sarasota Bay and Charlotte Harbor, and then ultimately the Springs Coast, which will come out a little bit later. But yeah, we expect that the official release will be sometime, hopefully this time next year, we'll have the maps released for the public. And you guys, of course, and many of you in the room I'm sure we'll have conversations as this process moves forward throughout the year when we start getting the draft numbers together.
Just regarding Old Tampa Bay, just to emphasize, there's a concern about the circulation up there because of all the causeways. So that's something else that's going to be coming out of this capacity study. There's going to be a quick little check on that.
Yeah, that's long been the focus of discussion for Old Tampa Bay is the causeways and how they inhibit circulation.
So I'm curious. Right.
That's the easy thing to point the finger at, and I think
Right.
it's justified.
Well, you can figure it out, but what can you do about it, right? So so which do you think is easier? Dealing with nitrogen regulation or making alterations to the causeways? Do you have a sense for anybody?
I think that the more diverse approaches we can have, the better. We only have a few number of knobs that we can turn. Nutrient load allocations is one that we've used for years. They've done a good job in recovering the bay, but another knob is potential alterations of the causeways, but that's a very big knob that's hard to turn. And we need a lot of buy-in and support from other entities that may not be ready to do so. And we need a lot of scientific evidence to support a decision that would do that. And I think some of the work you've done is helpful. I still think there's a lot more that needs to be done. And there's a lot of questions too about what would happen if there's additional causeway alterations. Would there be effects downstream, or would it just move the problem elsewhere, or how much of an alteration is needed? Those are important science questions that are good to answer, but at the same time, the term analysis, paralysis by analysis, that's also the danger too. So being mindful of just perpetual cycle of research rather than actually doing something is also really important, because we know, these problems aren't super complicated. We do need some evidence to support decisions, but at the same time, we don't need to keep evaluating something that is fairly obvious, like the water stays in one place for a long time and it gets warm and algae grows, But yeah, I can't say which is the largest driving factor. They're all important, and it's really what is the easiest low-hanging fruit to address with these nutrient water quality issues. Allocations are a good one, but they can only get us so far.
I could also chime in too. This is Ed. From cost perspective, I think those two different management interventions are pretty similar, but from a permittability standpoint, they're probably vastly different. I think there's going to be some significant gains in terms of wastewater discharge loads being reduced into the future, just based on recent Senate bills motivating for more beneficial use of reclaimed water. We know there are still direct discharges to Old Tampa Bay, so those are projected to go away by 2032 as long as that Senate bill is maintained and sort of that beneficial reuse clause is maintained in the region. So those costs to upgrade wastewater facilities are probably about the same as pursuing a causeway alteration, but they're vastly different in terms of permittability sort of constraints. It isn't to say that one is better than the other. I think as we move forward in managing Old Tampa Bay, which is on the brink of that tipping point, I think has been expressed through some of Marcus's presentation as well as our discussions in the past. We can't, I think, rest our laurels just on one management action into the future. We've addressed a lot of the low-hanging fruit in Tampa Bay over the past 30, 40 years. And it's going to be these harder projects to implement that really maintains the health of the bay moving forward with the additional challenges and stressors that we're going to see. So, those two management interventions from a cost perspective, I think are on the same footing. When you talk about non-point source loads and stormwater loads, that's an entirely different sort of beast to tackle, not only in Old Tampa Bay, but throughout the watershed. It's a matter of where those opportunities exist in our watershed, as well as how large of a scale that we could implement projects that would have a meaningful impact on both sort of the hydrologic conditions as well as the nutrient loads emanating from stormwater. So that is a challenging one. That's probably going to be a magnitude more in terms of cost as well as permittability constraints if we're talking about doing it at a scale that would have a benefit for water quality in the bay. That's kind of my sort of view on where we could focus our efforts, and not to say that we should be focusing on one sort of intervention. I think, again, we have to focus on all of them as we have done in the past, because that's has been the strategy that has worked. And I think that will remain into the future, particularly in Old Tampa Bay where it's facing multiple stressors. That's just my 2 cents from Steve's question.
Just another thought to put out there is, especially with Old Tampa Bay, I don't think we want to understate the importance of the legacy load that's in this bay segment, especially up in the Safety Harbor, Mobley Bay area, where you've got a lot of, organic sediment that just has been deposited over the years. And so doing the things that we know work, absolutely, we have to continue to do that, but with the understanding that there's enough legacy load, I think, in that bay segment, that it might take some time to work that through the system before we start to see maybe a trajectory shift where, we're seeing these permanent improvements.
Yeah, to your point, I mean, you can look at the long-term recovery of the bay, 20 years, after the obvious nutrient sources were somewhat controlled. And it might take an equally long amount of time for Old Tampa Bay to start behaving.
I think that was a great point, Chris. And, over the past 2 years, we might have added to that legacy load with some of the organic material that has built up in the Old Tampa Bay system might not have gotten out. So that's a great point.
So I just was attending a meeting recently and heard that FDOT has consultants working on a feasibility study related to resiliency of the Courtney Campbell Causeway. And I think this might be the opportunity to try to at least share with them some of the science that we need to ask them to incorporate in order to protect the bay.
Yeah, we welcome FDOT to any of our meetings.
Might be a time to reach out.
Yeah, Ed, they're part of the NMC, correct?
Yeah, and we're aware of those ongoing discussions and we've been working with the city of Clearwater as well as with partnership on a project on the Western Courtney Campbell with FDOT's interest for both resiliency as well as for these tidal circulation improvements. So we're aware of their interest, and that might be the next potential causeway alteration that we see. Again, it's going to be on the western side of the Courtney Campbell, though.
For what it's worth, when the eastern was put in, there was, it was a pretty, the observations before and after were fairly limited in space to that particular location, but at least in terms of water quality changes and just fish using the passage, that kind of thing, it was fairly quick. So when these cuts are put in, changes tend to happen rapidly. So how that translates to the larger base segment, like I said, still a lot of unknowns, but at least in that particular location, you can expect some pretty positive outcomes fairly quickly.
Open discussion items, another seagrass update. Ed mentioned the current regulations on the books to reduce loads coming from direct discharges of reclaims. Just so you're aware, there is a committee bill out right now. It's not being sponsored by any one legislator. There are committee bills, one out of the House and one out of the Senate, to ratify the statewide stormwater rule, which would have a significant impact on reductions from stormwater from development. So if you're not aware and it's something that's important to you, I would reach out and support. DEP has been doing a lot of outreach. They have one-pagers on it. Unfortunately, it's already been changed a portion of it has been changed by a special interest who got something inserted. Really trying to limit those types of changes to the statewide stormwater rule that was already adopted and went through the whole process. This is the first time stormwater regulations really have been changed in a meaningful way since they were adopted in the 1980s. So I just want you to think about that. Think about the science and how it has changed, everything that we just talked about in this room today. And if we sat here and said that we're managing Tampa Bay exactly the same way we did 30 years ago, everybody in this room would laugh. You would laugh if we were managing fisheries that way, or looking at how we look at circulation and wave attenuation, or any other piece of science that we talked about, HABs and pyrididium blooms. And if we were reliant on science that was over 30 years old, what would they think about this organization? It wouldn't be good. But here we are, 2024, and we are still using stormwater criteria that are flawed, and we've known it as a state. We've known it to be true since the 1980s. So this is a really monumental step, even with some of the changes that special interests have tried to influence in there. And we really need that rule to be adopted. Those of us who deal with impaired waters beyond Tampa Bay, we have TMDL implementation plans and all kinds of things that we want to do to address all of the tributaries and lakes that ultimately flow into the bay or into the Gulf side. And when the overwhelming majority of the land is in private hands being developed, this is a tool in the toolbox, as Marcus was saying. There's no one thing that's going to do it. It's a multitude of things. Well, this is one of those things that is incredibly important, that as development, new development, and redevelopment occurs within the Tampa Bay watershed, that the quality of the stormwater is treated to an extent that betters our local waterways. So it's out there, it's on the board. Please be aware. If you have the means to support it, please support the department. They've been working really hard to get it over the finish line. Any other open forum items?
I just want to let everybody know that we are accepting applications for projects for TBERF, and we're accepting applications now through March 13th. We have about $700,000 available, and projects typically range from about $25,000 to $250,000. There will be an informational webinar for anyone with questions or who just wants more information. That webinar will be February 7th from 11 to 12 p.m. and will be run by Jessica Lewis, who manages TBERF and Bay Mini Grants now. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Jessica or attend the webinar.
Yeah, just the two announcements we had was the TBERF RFP that's due the 13th, is that right?
Yes.
And then another one that is probably too late, but brought to my attention, due January 31st. It's Seagrass Restoration Technology Initiative, which is, I think, the first year they're doing this. This is Moat UF and one other group that's doing this, but it's obviously targeted towards seagrass restoration. There's a lot of questions now about feasibility, practice, and all that stuff. And I think that RFP is meant to spur some of those questions, address some of those questions. So those are the only announcements we had. Mark?
Yeah, I just wanted to let folks know we've got a NOAA-funded program we're calling Crowd the Bay. It's a citizen science initiative to put data loggers on volunteer vessels to collect all their depth sounder information. Part of an international program on crowdsourced bathymetry focused on Tampa Bay. So we're having a workshop on the Monday before GumCon, the 19th. In the afternoon. If anybody's interested in knowing more, I just sent you a link to it.
I'll be there.
Okay. And be happy to tell you more about it.
Very cool. Next meeting is March 27th. And if anybody has ideas for speakers, I got nothing. I have some ideas, but I'd love to hear from you guys.
We'd also love to see you in person, for those of you online.
A lot of space left in the room. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.